Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our December webinar from the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I just want to go through one or two of the usual things that I always like to remind you all about. First up, we will be recording this webinar, and we've recorded all previous webinars. So to find them, if you'd like to review some of them, head to the website, go under the resources page, and you'll see YRN webinars under there. It actually links to our YouTube page as well. So if you know our YouTube site, you'll see them all listed there. And that is, in fact, the YouTube site there. Just a couple of other reminders. Given how close we are to a particular commercial event happening next week, just thought you all might like a reminder that we have a huge number of book reviews on our website for anybody who's looking for some last minute presents. We're up to 42 absolutely fantastic reviews, and also you'll notice we have books for children as well. And we've reviewed 10 of those for younger children, so well worth having a look under the resources section of the website. In terms of keeping up to date and involved and finding out about what we're up to and things that are going on in the Yorkshire area when it comes to rewilding, you can go to the Join Us section of the website, sign up for our newsletter, get involved with chat groups on our Rewilding forum. And if you're not already a member of that, hit that button there to join and sign up to the forum. We've got a few more events lined up. Our next webinar in January is Emma Wright of the National Trust talking about the 10-year strategy of the National Trust as it relates to Yorkshire. And I have just noticed, I think we're actually fully booked for this one, but keep an eye out for any spaces becoming available. But we have a winter networking day in February at Castle Howard. And you'll see this and all other events listed under our events site. As I hope you saw on some of the slides that were showing us before we came onto the webinar, we rely very much on donations. So if it is within your means, we'd very much appreciate you going to the support us section of our website and making a donation. And for those of you who are interested in helping us expand our activities and with the running of the Yorkshire Rewilding Network, we also have something called the Wild 100 Club, which you can also find under the About pull down on our website. I'm going to facilitate the Q&A at the end tonight. If you actually use the Q&A part of Zoom, feel free to chat as much as you want under the chat section. But specifically, if you want to ask questions, which I'll hopefully get around to at the end, use the Q&A button on the Zoom menu. So it's my absolute pleasure to now introduce our speakers for this evening. So Sara King is Rewilding Manager at Rewilding Britain, and she's going to outline how Rewilding Britain sees rewilding at a national level. And then she's going to hand up to our own Jeff Davitt, who's one of our Yorkshire Rewilding Network trustees. Jeff's going to cover YRN's approach to rewilding from small scale and urban settings right through to larger scale projects. So with that briefest of introductions, I shall hand over to Sara and then Jeff.
Thank you so much, John. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's really lovely to see so many of you here. I'm Sara King. I'm Rewilding Manager at Rewilding Britain. So I work with a lot of landowners and rewilders who are rewilding land on the ground. I'm going to tell you a little bit, this is going to be a very whistle-stop tour of what rewilding is, how it's working in Britain. And so bear with me, it's going to be quite a quick go through, but hopefully it will give you a great overview about rewilding in a British context. For anyone that doesn't know about Rewilding Britain, we're a charity. We don't own or manage any projects ourselves, but we have three main areas of work. So we catalyse rewilding, and this is mostly through the work that I do, which I'll be talking a little bit about this evening. We try to influence policy and remove barriers for rewilding projects. And we also do a lot of work around engaging people in what rewilding really is and how it can help us all. So just to start with the definitions, just because it's a good starting place so that we all know that we're talking about the same sort of thing. We define rewilding as the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature can take care of itself. So generally, it's looking at how do we restore natural processes to really then eventually allow nature to be in the driving seat and lead the way. So we're not looking for set outcomes. We're not looking to create a certain amount of set habitat and then manage it in a particular way. It's about creating these dynamic landscapes where nature is changing and where we can see different actors within that landscape having an impact. But it's definitely not about removing people from that landscape either. And it encourages a balance between people and nature. And I think we need to remember that we are part of ecosystems, and rewilding very much puts us within those ecosystems and puts us in a place where we can work with nature instead of trying to work against it. And underneath that definition, we have 5 principles of rewilding. So this gives us a little bit more detail under that quite top level definition of how we might want to work and how rewilding can support different elements across Britain. So support nature and people together is very much at the forefront of our principles of rewilding. As I said, we're very much part of nature. We don't sit separate from it. So it's very important to make sure that when we're rewilding land and sea, we're putting people at the centre of that as well. Working at nature's scale, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in my next slide, about how we can think about scale and how that might affect our approach to rewilding. Of course, letting nature lead, I've already mentioned, we're really putting nature in the driving seat rather than us, and trying to look at how we can support those dynamic natural processes. Creating resilient nature-based economies, making sure that we are creating landscapes that support people who can live and work there, and make sure that we're not looking at an opportunity to push people off the land. That's very much not what rewilding is about. And also thinking more long term. Generally, we tend to think in the next 2, 5, 10 years. When we're thinking about rewilding, we're thinking about the next 50, 80, 100 years. And a lot of the work that we're doing now, we won't necessarily see the results of because we're thinking very much that long-term thinking. And that really is the timescale that nature works at. Generally, you can see some change happening within 5, 10 years. But if we're looking at natural cycles, we really want to be thinking a lot more long-term than that. And some rewilding projects are thinking of 100-year, 200-year visions when they're starting their rewilding journeys. So I mentioned that we've been talking a lot about scale, and you can rewild at all sorts of scales, but generally when we're thinking about rewilding, the more space we have, the more we are going to be able to allow natural processes to really function. And so what we're trying to do is move it up this scale. So on this graph, you'll see some green dots. These are kind of typical nature reserves in the UK. So generally they're quite small in size, and the management intensity is quite high as a result. So quite often they're being mown to keep species-rich grassland in a particular state. You might have done things like scrub bashing and bracken bashing to try and make sure that these habitats are being protected. That's kind of what we see in more typical UK nature reserves. When we're looking at rewilding projects, we're trying to move them down this scale basically. So increase the project size as much as we possibly can, whether that's connecting projects together with corridors or whether it's looking at can we have multi-partnership visions and trying to reduce the management intensity with that scale. So as we start to get bigger, larger scale projects, we can generally reduce that management intensity because there is more room for those natural processes to play a part. And so what we start to see is this trend of rewilding projects going down the diagonal on this graph as much as we possibly can, because that can affect how much we can move up the rewilding spectrum. So just to take a step back now that we've kind of defined what rewilding is, the next question we need to ask is why rewilding? Why do we need to see a change? Why can't we carry on as business as usual? Well, there's lots of answers to this question, and I won't spend the whole evening talking just about why rewilding because it would take us quite a long time to get through. But we can't ignore the fact that we are in a biodiversity crisis, we're in a climate crisis. I think everyone on this call is probably fully aware of that. We are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And time again, we're seeing state of nature reports coming out showcasing that more species risk extinction and that we're seeing more of a depletion in our nature. So we do need to think about a complete step change in that system and think about how do we get bigger areas showcasing more nature and really supporting some of that nature recovery. With the climate crisis, we also see that there's going to be a change in our future landscapes. We did a report a few years ago now that showed that the UK's climate is changing. That means that it's moving northwards at 5 kilometres per year. And what this means is that mobile species are likely to have to move further north to make sure that they're still within their range. And that's at a rate of 5 kilometres per year, which is quite substantial. Some of the mobile species can possibly do okay with that, assuming that there's habitat there to support them. Some of the less mobile species are probably going to struggle with that. So that's why we need to think about these large landscape scale change opportunities to really create resilient habitats for some of these species and to make sure that we have these connected areas to allow species to move as the climate changes and becomes warmer. I also really like showing this illustration from Ark Nature, a charity in the Netherlands. They do some really great illustrations about some of the keystone species, so it's definitely well worth a visit afterwards. But I particularly love this illustration because it really showcases our relationship with nature. So if we look at the top left of this spiral, that's back in time where we've got a lot of our ecosystem still intact. There might be species that were once here, such as bear and wolves, and we're looking at kind of prehistoric times there where we were very much at one with nature. As we started to see the Industrial Revolution and we've started to see the Agricultural Revolution, these strands have started to come apart and we've started to see ourselves as being separate from nature and we've started to categorize habitats as being separate and we've got more livestock. Rewilding is about trying to pull those threads back together. So looking at the bottom left part of this illustration, where we're part of those ecosystems and we can create much more opportunities within our cities and our countryside. We're rebuilding a lot of those missing species. We're rewiggling rivers and really starting to make sure that we are part of those ecosystems and can feel part of them and explore them and get all the benefits from them. So I really love this thread just to show how through rewilding and nature recovery we can rethink our future landscapes and start to bring those threads back together. And I really do believe that's what rewilding does. Anyone who works in rewilding, experiences rewilding, you really can start to see those threads coming back together and we can start to see our place within these landscapes once more. So what are natural processes? I've been speaking about natural processes quite a lot. What actually are they? Well, they're all interactions within the kind of web of life. So it's things like seasonal change. We know that we've got things like migratory patterns or different opportunities for foraging. Seasonal change is one of those natural processes. Life and death is another key process. We've got weather, geological processes. The hydrological cycle, the water cycle, is particularly important, a natural process, especially around how water moves across the land. We've got rivers, streams, drainage, all sorts of natural hydrological processes there. Soil formation and soil health is another key area. Impacts of animals such as grazing, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And then there's a lot of things around habitat succession, which I will touch on a little bit, but is basically that succession between bare ground, grassland, scrub, trees, and the dynamics within that as you start to have other actors coming in that push back some of that succession and the dynamism that brings. So I'll speak a little bit about that later on, but that's what we're talking about when we're talking about natural processes. And rewilding is about identifying these natural processes, identifying which natural processes aren't working, and also trying to restore those broken natural processes as much as we possibly can. So I like to think of natural processes as a game of Jenga. If we imagine a Jenga tower with all the pieces in place, it's quite a solid tower. You can have extreme weather coming in and rock that tower. It's probably going to be pretty resilient. But in Britain, we definitely don't have a full Jenga tower. We've got lots of missing blocks. We're missing predators. We have straightened a lot of our rivers. We are not necessarily allowing that natural succession to happen. We've lost a lot of our big wild herbivores. So we've got quite a shaky Jenga tower, and with climate change and the extreme weather coming in, that tower is looking really shaky. So what we're trying to think about through rewilding is how can we put some of those blocks back in place, either through restoring natural processes or species reintroductions, or mimicking some of those natural processes ourselves. So, for example, if we think about coppicing, that could be mimicking a natural process in the absence of bison and beavers. And lots of people, there's quite a lovely story that actually we learned how to coppice from beavers. They showed us how to do it, and that's something that we've then taken forward. you spoke about an event in February about building a dam and creating leaky dams is obviously mimicking beavers where they're not present. Harvesting animals for their meat, whether it's deer management or whether it's some of the livestock, is mimicking those predators if they're absent and we can't bring them back. And sometimes sustainable forestry, like continuous canopy, where you selectively fell trees rather than doing clear-cut felling, again, is mimicking those herbivores in a woodland as they walk through, knocking them over. So we can start to think in natural processes and think, can we restore that, or can we try to mimic it ourselves? And by doing that, we're rebuilding that Jenga tower and starting to rebuild our ecosystems. And we can mimic some species. We've tried to do it. If anyone's done any gardening and done some rootling, you might be trying to mimic a wild boar. But actually, there's lots of complex interactions that come from these species that we don't even know yet, let alone be able to mimic. So species reintroduction, especially around keystone species, are incredibly important for restoring those natural processes, and actually is one of the key places where we've learned so much more about natural processes and nature through it. So things like the whales in the oceans, we know that they drive ecological processes, they have an impact on the carbon cycle, they have an impact on krill and foraging for many other species. Some of you might have seen the Serengeti rules where there's information there about sea otters and their impact and their presence or absence on a lot of the ecosystems around them. And some of you will have heard about trophic cascades. This is where keystone species go back into an area and has a cascade effect on the rest of the ecosystem. And that's where we start to see these relationships between species and how important they are for nature recovery and for that ecosystem to function. So I'm going to talk a little bit about species and some of the species that we're missing because they are such a crucial part of restoring natural processes. And a lot of our landscapes and seascapes are actually quite empty without them. So we've got quite a lot of keystone species on our website. Here's a selection of some of the main ones. These are all keystone species that would have once been here in Britain. We know this from the fossil record. We can also look to mainland Europe for similar habitats to see what might have been here. Many of you will notice that I've got a bit of a bias towards mammals. I am generally a bit of a mammal ecologist, so apologies for that. I am also very passionate about a lot of the other species. But generally, when it comes to restoring natural processes, mammals do have quite a big impact on our ecosystems. There are other keystone species, including white-tailed eagles, golden eagles, and a few others, but I do have a little bit of a mammal bias, so apologies for that. But if anyone wants to know about other species, we can maybe pick them up in the questions afterwards. But this, if we imagine our full suite of keystone species in Britain, this is a sample of some of them. And I put red crosses through the ones that we're missing. And actually, it might surprise you that we've actually have got quite a lot of these species back in Britain already. They're not necessarily widespread, but we've definitely got them here, which I think is part of the success of the rewilding movement. There is obviously more to be done to get them in the wild. So bison, for example, at the moment, there's only one bison project in Britain, and that's in Kent in a fenced enclosure. If we wanted to mimic natural processes more, we'd be thinking about, could we have bison in other areas? Could we have them in bigger areas where they can have a bit more free reign? So we do have these species here, but a lot of them are very much not widespread, so there's still lots of work to do. So just take you through some of the main guilds and the role that they have. We're going to start with predators. We do have some predators in Britain. In particular, some of the success stories actually from the last few years has been pine martens and their spread across Britain through reintroductions and also through their natural spread as well. We've got pine martens in Scotland and have been there for quite a few years. We're starting to see them spread across England and Wales now as well, which is fantastic. And the role of predators is generally having an impact on prey species. So pine martens in particular are known to predate quite heavily on grey squirrels. Grey squirrels did not evolve alongside pine martens because they are a non-native invasive species, and so they can't escape pine martens the same way that red squirrels can. They generally are bigger and heavier than red squirrels, so they can't escape their clutches quite as much. So there's lots of research that show that when pine martens are reintroduced, grey squirrel numbers go down, which could open opportunities for other red squirrels to be reintroduced, and probably has an impact on some of the other ecosystem and natural processes such as bark stripping and damage. We've also got wildcat being reintroduced in some areas, and I'll talk about some of the reintroductions that are happening, but they have an impact on rodents and also other species as well where they're present. They can also have an impact sometimes on domestic cats in some of these wild areas and try to push them out a little bit, which can also help some of our bird life. Of course, we've got foxes still present within much of Britain, and they're taking a lot of that predator role because we don't have many of our other predators in Britain. Rewilding quite often gets accused of just being about the predators. It's very much not the case. I think we need to acknowledge that we're missing wolves, we're missing lynx at the moment as well, and that is going to have an impact on our natural processes. But we're quite good at stepping in and being the predator through deer management and through managing livestock. What we're not so good at is possibly the ecology of fear impact of predators. So moving predators on when they're grazing to minimize damage to some of the vegetation. So that might be something that we possibly need to work on. But I think it's worth acknowledging that we don't have these predators here. And so there's only so many natural processes that we can put in place until they are reintroduced. Onto omnivores. So we would have once had brown bear in Britain. Again, a very big species, needs a lot of space. No one's looking at brown bear reintroduction in Britain, but we've got some other omnivores that can take that role as well. So we've got badgers, of course, and wild boar. And there are wild boar throughout the Forest of Dean and throughout a few other areas where they started to spread out. There's also wild boar emerging in Scotland. And I'll just move on to the next slide. These are not wild boar. These are Tamworth pigs at Knepp. Pigs are one of the stars of rewilding projects because they do a lot of work to restore natural processes. And these pigs at Knepp are doing a fantastic job rootling around, creating bare ground, breaking up the vegetation, and providing opportunities for seed dispersal, for plants to start to come through. And they're kind of the reset animals. So they reset those natural processes, reset that natural succession to allow a more diverse vegetation sward to come through. So pigs are very important. They are used as a proxy for the wild boar where wild boar aren't present, and they can have a massive impact on rewilding projects. They're also pretty cute as well. I've got a bit of a soft spot for pigs. And they really do a great job rootling around, creating these opportunities for various different plants to come through. They've also been shown to have a really big impact, these bare ground areas have a big impact on other species, such as turtle doves at Knepp. They also think they're having an impact on the butterflies, creating bare ground that can help support those. So really, really great species to have what we call ecosystem engineers. And finally, just talking about herbivores, very important guild of species that are largely missing from Britain. We've got obviously high levels of deer, including some non-native deer across most of Britain. We've got lots of red deer in Scotland, not so many red deer in England, and certainly not in Wales. And we see proxies being used for our extinct aurochs. So cattle, for example, are introduced onto rewilding projects in low numbers to try and mimic the extinct auroch, which is a wild species of cattle. And then thinking about the larger herbivores that we're missing, so bison and elk, for example, we don't have these in our landscapes anymore. And so the role that they have in terms of seed dispersal, bark stripping, browsing, walking through scrub means that we don't necessarily have those actors in the landscape that create the mosaic that we want to see through rewilding projects. And I just wanted to show you this table. This is in our grazing guide, which is available on the website if anyone wants to have a look in any more detail. But essentially what we need to think about is what is the full guild of herbivores and making sure that we have as much of that full guild as possible, because each of these animals has a different role within the landscape. So a bison is going to have slightly different impacts to an elk, which will have different impacts to wild boar. So when we're looking at rewilding projects, we're trying to think how many of these herbivores can we bring into the landscape to have these different actors have the different impact. They're going to graze on different species. They're going to have a different impact on different parts of the landscape. And those interactions and impacts are really, really important. So can we try and bring as many of these species back into an area as possible? And this is where that scale comes in, because if you're working at smaller scales, you can't possibly have all of these herbivores within the landscape. But if we're working at big scales, scales, we can start to think about bringing as many of these species as we possibly can to create those different dynamics. And this is another infographic that we included in our grazing guide that starts to show you what we mean when we're looking at the impacts of herbivores within our landscapes. So if we start with the bottom line, if there's no herbivores or few herbivores in the landscape, we start to see this progression from grassland to scrub to woodland. And generally that woodland is what we call closed canopy. So it's quite dark underneath with not very much vegetation. With herbivores is the top line. So we've got herbivores in there grazing and browsing, knocking things back, creating much more variety and much more of a mosaic. And if we can't have herbivores there, that's when we might have got involved on nature reserves doing bracken bashing or scrub bashing to mimic those grazing animals and to keep some of those open areas. So this is what we're talking about when we're thinking natural processes, and we're thinking, how can we start to mimic them as much as we possibly can? And finally, scavengers is another important natural process that we really don't actually have very much in Britain. You will have seen some carcasses, whether it's roadkill, sometimes there's carcasses in the countryside, but because of our legislation, we generally don't see carcasses in the landscape anymore, which means that we don't have food for eagles and other species as well. So thinking about, is there ways to start to get some of these carcasses back in the landscape for that nutrient cycling is a really important natural process that we're missing. And finally, beavers are a herbivore, but I do like to single them out because they are very, very special. Beavers are what got me into rewilding in the first place. They're an amazing creature, true ecosystem engineers. Where beavers are present, they build dams, they coppice areas, they hold water, they have an absolutely massive impact on nature. And I could do a whole presentation and talk about beavers, which I won't do, but they are fantastic creatures, and it's a real success story that over the last 5-6 years we've started to see them so widespread because they are so important for a whole range of other things, and they support a whole range of opportunities for other wildlife as well. And I thought it'd be useful just to put this map together because I think it's quite a hopeful message to see a lot of the rewilding species reintroduction projects that are coming through. That this is by no means a comprehensive list, but I think it's really good to show that there are opportunities for hope and there are things happening, whether it's lynx that are being considered to be reintroduced to Scotland and the north of England, whether it's the bison that have arrived in Kent. We've got white-tailed eagles in the Isle of Wight and obviously in Scotland. They're flying all over Britain. We've got wildcat projects that are being planned at the moment for various different places. And we're even talking about the potential for pelicans on the Somerset Levels or in Norfolk. So things are happening, things are changing, and we are starting to recognise the importance of bringing back these keystone species. And hopefully, once all these projects go ahead, we can start to see a reverse in those trends and see nature start to go on the increase rather than state of nature reports always showing us declines. I'm also, not only have I got a mammal bias, I'm also a terrestrial ecologist, so I have a terrestrial bias, but that doesn't mean that rewilding doesn't happen at sea. And we're seeing quite a lot of marine rewilding that's happening on our coasts, whether it's oyster reintroductions that are being put in to help the water quality of our oceans, rebuild oyster reefs that can help reduce the impact of waves and storms, or whether it's seagrass planting that we're starting to see. And with all of this, we start to see the return of life in our oceans as well. And I think oceans have a bit of a poor time of it because they are very much out of sight, out of mind, and you don't necessarily see the damage that's happening on the ocean floor. So being able to showcase how we can start to rewild these areas, often through taking away dredging and trawling practices, can really start to showcase how our seas can be alive again and support a whole range of nature. So final section, what does rewilding actually look like? It's a very good question, and one that I think we have to start looking at Europe to really get an idea of what rewilding could look like in Britain. So Rewilding Europe have done some amazing illustrations. They've also got some fantastic landscapes showcasing what rewilding at scale could look like and are really inspirational for what we could start to achieve here. I'm going to start with the Danube Delta, which is a fantastic area in Romania and Ukraine. And they really are restoring the delta there. So restoring wetlands. They've got pelicans there. They've been restoring water buffalo, as well as a range of other things. It's also a fantastic destination for tourism. So they have lots of boats going around. They support loads of new jobs through this. And what we can start to see is not only the abundance of life that can be supported by these naturally functioning watercourses and deltas, but also the tourism and the jobs that that can bring. So I think it's a really great example of how we could maybe rethink some of our own waterways and some of our own wetlands and start to think about whether we can apply some of those learnings here. Can we start to restore some of the areas of the Somerset Levels, for example, to start to mimic some of the work in the Danube Delta and use that as inspiration? In the Southern Carpathians, there's another great example of showcasing how rewilding can be implemented through bison reintroducing these large herbivores to an area, as well as supporting and coexisting alongside other species such as wolves. You'll see in this illustration that there are very much people within this landscape, as well as farming, and the rewilding and the farmers can benefit each other as well. So I like to use this example as one that showcases how we can really have these multi-use landscapes. And the Greater Coa Valley in Portugal is another great example of how to reintroduce a predator like the Iberian lynx and how to bring that in alongside restoring herbivores like wild ponies, semi-wild cattle, and really start to create these mosaics. The Greater Coa Valley has a great story of how rewilding has actually brought families back into the area through the work and the jobs that have been created, which now means that those schools have been secured, which is a fantastic example of how rewilding can rejuvenate some of these areas. But what about Britain? It's okay looking to Europe, but it looks a bit different here. And I'm going to showcase you. I'm going to show you now an illustration that we've done, and it is an idea of it's an illustration for fantasy. So we were imagining 100 years time with an upland river valley, what it could look like in rewilding. And there are a few bits in here that I think maybe aren't so realistic. If I ever see an eagle flying off with a wild boar in its talons, I will be very much surprised. But it really is just to illustrate what we could have in Britain within our countryside. We could have beavers back, we could have re-wiggled rivers, we could have a lot of these keystone species here, and we can have more trees on our hills and create these dynamic landscapes. We aren't the first movers on this. We can very much learn from Europe. And so let's use our imagination to think about how we can have a landscape that supports this much wildlife, but also has people within this. You'll see that there's roads and buildings in there. And we very much have a kaleidoscope of different approaches in Britain. These are just a few photos of some of the rewilding projects that are actually happening on the ground, from heathland to uplands to wood pasture through to our rivers and coasts. There's loads of different things happening, and each rewilding project is very much unique. And if you go on our website, you'll be able to have a look and see the growing movement of rewilding projects. So I'm very lucky to work with the Rewilding Network. We've got a map on the website that showcases some of the projects there. Now, there's now over 1,000 member projects in the network, all rewilding at slightly different scales, doing slightly different things. And it's fantastic to really see the movement grow over the last 5 years or so, to start to see the number of projects that are rewilding now, showcasing how it can be done, and also showing the benefits, not just to wildlife, but also to people. We also have local networks, and local networks and groups are vital, including obviously the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. They bring people together from different backgrounds to shape these local landscapes. They support how we might connect larger projects with smaller projects. And so it's really great to be here tonight talking about rewilding on behalf of the Yorkshire Rewilding Network, and then passing over to Jeff so that he can explain how we can also rewild at smaller scales. So I will stop there and I will pass over to Jeff.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah. I was just checking, it's just over 5 years since you did our first ever webinar about beavers, interestingly. So if people want to see that, it's still on our website.
Yes, I can talk for hours about beavers, it is true.
So let me just concentrate so that I bring up the correct presentation. So yeah, I'd just like to spend about 15 minutes bringing things down to a more local level. All of that Sarah has so brilliantly described in not very long at all is wonderful to see, but can seem a bit hard to access if you haven't got 30,000 acres in your back pocket or whatever. You can visit these places, but to get involved ourselves can feel quite daunting. So here in Yorkshire, in the last 5 years, doing a presentation like this, I would normally be including photos from NEP or things that we hope might happen in Yorkshire one day. But to pick up again on a lot of what Sarah has mentioned, we do have a lot of activity. We do have disturbance from these iron-aid pigs up at Broughton Sanctuary near Skipton, doing their thing beautifully, rootling the ground and disturbing it. And this summer, when it was so dry, in the depressions where the pigs had been, right in the wettest bit that held on to any moisture, is where there are saplings coming through. So straight away, yes, some of this is long term, but within months you can see the effect of these processes beginning to start and breaking up that just plain grass top. We've got plenty of scope for decay. If dead wood is left in the landscape, which increasingly land managers are now doing. So we can see that happening around the place. And we do have the keystone species. This is the beaver dam over at Cropton near Pickering, which was the subject of a trial study for, I think it's been going about 6 years now, and assessments underway as to whether the fences might be opened up so that the animals can spread. And there are other beaver families in Yorkshire now and more to come. Haven't got them everywhere yet, but another way of moderating water flow on the moorland especially is to establish mosses. And apologies if we've got botanists, these are probably not the right species of mosses to be on Yorkshire moors, but these can really hold water back in the dry spells and stop the flood peaks coming down into the valleys. So can also be our friends in helping us get through the increasingly changing weather that we've got. On the marine side, we have also got abundance in places. So this is the seal colony over at Ravenscar, just south of Robin Hood's Bay. And every year there seem to be more and more, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these big seals now. They're clearly finding something to eat. So there is a food system in the North Sea there now, and more whales seem to be coming back too. And recently, the last couple of years, there have been tuna spotted off the Yorkshire coast. Another predatory fish, so predators are returning, particularly in the air and in the water. Maybe a bit slower on land because of all the interactions with us, but where they have a bit more space to do their thing, they are coming back. And if you looked at that landscape that Sarah put with a mixture of woodland, heathland, grassland, people still there, this is Upper Wharfdale last year. And actually, it's got quite a good base from which to work if we just give nature that bit of space. So we're not starting from billiard table flatness in all areas. We can see that we can make some progress with rewilding in our own region. And especially if you look at visitors or scarce species, all of these 5 have been in Yorkshire quite recently. So storks were up near Skipton, I think it was earlier this year, if not last year. There was definitely one confirmed pine marten over in Dalby Forest for quite a few years. They have markings on their bibs, so it could be identified that it was the same individual left there and went travelling and turned up at Spurn Point of all places, and then I believe went back again. So it just needs some company. So the sooner we can get pine martens back into the region in numbers would be great. We have a few red squirrels already, but as Sarah mentioned, the pine martens may help control the greys and give the reds a bit more chance. And for the eagles, the white-tailed eagles that were released on the south coast of England, down around the Isle of Wight, several of them now each summer have spent a few weeks near Whitby, inland eating rabbits in the North York Moors, before they go back south to where they were released to try and breed. And my personal favourite that, because they're satellite tagged, several of the eagles from the south of Scotland Golden Eagle Project have been traced down as far as Nidderdale. They've not stayed, they've turned around and gone back north. But clearly that exploration is going on. So some of these charismatic species are really starting to be seen around our region. And if you look at what's happening sort of on a more permanent basis in the region, this is YRN's map on its website, where we ask people who are rewilding to let us put a blob on our map. Different categories, anything from gardens, small, medium, large scale, community groups. We will get round to getting a marine one on there before too long. But we're on the live map now, I think above 60 projects. And if you click on any one of the circles, it will tell you a bit more about the project and how to contact the people running it if you're interested. Sometimes it's direct to them, sometimes it's through YRN, but it's a great way to find out more about what's happening. And we would dearly love to fill in the gaps around that, particularly in the south and east of the region, sort of in the north centre and over towards Bridlington. There's a lot more that we believe is going on. We just need to catch up with it. So, as Sarah said, Sarah mentioned a spectrum of rewilding, and we certainly include that in our assessment, particularly at smaller scale. Much of what Sarah spoke about on the rewilding spectrum was over to the right-hand side here, the larger scale stuff. And if this doesn't come through too well on the screen, the QR code on the right takes you to our webpage, where if you scroll down, you'll find this spectrum. But I'd like to talk just a bit about over to the left and some of the smaller scale stuff. Because even if you can't get all of the natural processes going over several centuries on a small scale, you can really see a massive effect in just a few years or sometimes even just months from some of these small scale activities. And sometimes they're things that are easier to do than not do. Prime among them for me is just stop using pesticides or herbicides or fungicides, things that kill stuff. We've developed over the years some really powerful chemicals that are brilliant at what they do, but surely they're not helping the whole ecosystem, which often can be built up from the bottom from insects and plants, fungi that other species will feed on. So sometimes just doing less, not going out and spraying stuff can help. Other times just planting a tree. And if you can make it a native tree, maybe make it an orchard tree, you get some produce from it. They're great for biodiversity locally. They're beautiful in the spring, and they just give you some of that connection to the land that you're on. You may have heard ponds are a really good thing to do as well. But I'd just like to go into some of the mindset behind different ways you can do these. So in a garden context, one of the things that might be said is have a log pile, because they're good for wildlife. So you can have a log pile, and here's our log pile in the porch. And okay, it gets dead leaves around it. It does get full of spiders' webs, who must only be there because they're insects to eat. And I have disturbed a vole out of there before. So there's some wildlife, but that's not really cutting it compared to a log pile that's like that, which is also in the garden, but is a whole lot less organised affair. We hadn't intended it would get grown over with brambles and other weeds, for want of a better word. It's where we used to grow raspberries, but not very well, my wife felt. So we moved the raspberry patch. The raspberries felt, never mind, we're carrying on. So there's a few of them in there. There's oregano. There's all sorts in there, but the birds and the insects around that space are just way more than they ever were before. And that's probably been there about 5 years now. We've never seen the middle of it since we put it there. It's probably decaying with fungi, all sorts of wood munching creatures in there. And it's just a tiny space for nature, in contrast to a sort of managed, ordered log pile that you could term the same thing. But if your mind is that you're giving nature space to do what it wants and you're not really trying to control where it goes, you can get an awful lot more out of it in terms of the abundance and the diversity of what's there. Meadows are quite popular. Sometimes they're whole fields, if someone has some land with a house. Other times it can just be a verge or a tiny patch of grass in your garden. And in the summer, they're beautiful. And again, the diversity of plants attracts lots of pollinators. You get loads of butterflies, moths. And I said hummingbirds then. Didn't mean that. Hoverflies was what I meant to say. Um, so they're great, but the tendency can be to follow what you kind of would want to do if you were harvesting the vegetation for feed, or if you can't get on the land when it gets too wet, you need to get the vegetation off in the summer. But if it's just a smaller patch, you don't really need to take it back to this neat and tidied, swept up, scalped state in the winter. On all of it or on some of it, you can just leave dead stems there. And you don't need to weed out if you get an oak tree starting to grow up in the middle that we've got here. Again, you just get way more diversity. It's providing great habitat and shelter through the winter for a range of species that we probably never see, but just creates that base so when the spring does come round, things can spring into life again. And if you're worried that people might think, oh, you just neglected your garden, you're not quite ready yet to have the neighbours thinking that of you. It can make a big difference just by mowing a path through a meadow. It doesn't matter how rough you leave the edges, but if there's a short path through, it's great for being able to access it, obviously, and see it. But it does also show others that it's a deliberate act and it's cared for. So, that can be an easy, accessible bit if you've got some space to do that. Even if you haven't got any land at all, we can all make a difference. So I say, if you've got a patch, leave some untidiness, don't use pesticides. But one of the things every one of us can do is use our voices. Studies suggest a much bigger number of people are concerned about the environment than those that actually talk about it. And you don't have to be an activist or an evangelist or however you want to brand it. You can just talk to your friends about rewilding. If you go on holiday to see wildlife, make sure you tell the people you're staying with, whether it's a campsite or a luxury hotel, that you're there to see the rewilded wildlife. It really starts to create that presence, costs you nothing, starts to build the mood and the movement for greater change. If you have the will to do so, write to policymakers. It's surprising how few communications start to make a difference, whether it's your MP, local council, don't know who else, but please don't leave the decisions that affect all of us to others. It doesn't take too much effort and it really does make a difference. And then the last one, my last mention really of the sort of pesticide side of things. Many of the worm and flea treatments used on cats and dogs are so toxic and so effective at what they do, they're not allowed to be used in agriculture. And firms set up regular subscriptions, so you just dose your animal with these every month. That's going on your pet, on you, in your house. Your dog goes for a walk. I know somebody whose dog jumped into a water tank on a walk, thought nothing of it. They went back the next day and there was just a layer of floating dead water beetles on that water tank. So please think about the chemicals that are in everyday use. You can also join up with others of like mind. There are increasing numbers of local groups, such as Leeds Rewilding, springing up in our region and elsewhere. And if there isn't one, speak to us and think about starting your own. We can't do it for you, but we can offer some tips that others have found useful. And get creative about what suits you. One of our subscribers who decided she was getting a bit long in the tooth for planting trees, decided she'd go out and collect seeds and grow them on for local sites. And increasingly frequently now, I get emails into our inbox asking to speak to Janet because they think she's a bit of a star, and we do too. So find a way that there's something that you can contribute. And a really rewarding way is to visit a local rewilding site. Each year we run visits to about 15 of the sites from our map, and they're a varied collection of size and location. And they just provide a lovely opportunity to discuss with the landholder what they've done, what they're finding, but at least as important to me, other people who are also finding out about it, and just share conversation. And this is, okay, it's a bit of a long quote, but I'll give you a moment to read it. It's from Emma Burnett, who's hosted 3 site visits now for us. And she talks about the joy it brings, the mix of people. And you see that goes from landowners, expert ecologists, just smallholders with a little bit of land, includes farmers, people just starting out, someone who've got decades of experience. And it's something different. And the last bit is what I love, that the questions change each time people come. Perspectives shift because people are seeing these landscapes alive with life. And what I really liked was it leaves the hosts seeing their own site with fresh eyes from all this interaction that they've had. So just to begin to wrap up, as John said at the start, you can find out what we're doing and access all the various materials we've got, find a way that works for you. We'd love it to be a two-way conversation, so do please tell us what you're up to, whether it's physically on the land, whether it's going out and experiencing rewilding. Do support us if you can afford to, please. And there's a reason for doing it. Rewilding is just such a great way, pretty quickly, of creating some abundance and diversity, albeit that on a small scale and in a short period of time, you don't get all of the full effects, but it's still, we would argue, really worthwhile. And let nature have the space to rebound. And please get involved. That's me. I'll pass back to John now and see if we have questions.
Excellent. Thank you, both of you. Excellent. I'm always amazed how positive everything to do with rewilding is when it's presented like that. Sarah, particularly like your mention of humans being a key part of ecosystems, I think it's really easy to forget that we are also a native species of this country. And Jeff, I've seen the seals at Raven Scar, but I didn't realize there were quite so many. I think I'll look more carefully next time I'm there. I had no idea there were that many. Yeah, we do have a load of questions, actually, and not a huge amount of time left, to be honest. So I'm just going to dive straight in with 2 or 3 of the notable ones that stood out. First one's actually specifically addressed to you, Sarah, and it's about the potential for tension between the high management of areas that have specific species of birds and butterflies, moths and flora that we're trying to protect, versus the idea of letting nature do its own thing in some other areas, which may actually result in the loss of those species. And it's really sort of trying to get your view on that tension.
I think what we need in reality is both. And I don't think anyone is suggesting that we go to nature reserves and say, don't worry about it, let's just rewild it, because I think those are some really important areas that are protecting very rare species or very rare habitats. I think we need to think about how we affect areas around it. And there's plenty of land that could be better used for rewilding. So, for example, really low productivity agricultural land where people are fighting to try and produce food on it, maybe that would be better to be allocated to rewilding in nature, with some food still being produced through harvesting animals for meat or for kind of creating food areas or orchards. So I think I wouldn't like to see us replacing that approach with rewilding. I think we need to see both, so that we can then make sure that going forward we're restoring nature rather than losing any more than we already have lost.
Excellent, thank you. Jeff, since you were talking about species starting to appear over Nidderdale, there's a couple of questions here that maybe you can address. And the first is, how long do we actually think it's going to take for species like pine martens, beavers, and wildcats to be widespread and in reasonable abundance across the Yorkshire area?
Okay, thanks for that. My first thought was, oh, what number do I guess? But my second thought is to think that even when I was reasonably grown up, you would never see an otter.
Hmm.
And they've spread. Now, they do have the benefit they will spread cross-catchment, I believe, more easily than beavers. But pine martens are masters of travel. They will go huge distances looking for mates or territory. So I don't think the time when pine martens are more widespread is limited by how much they could spread. There's potentially an issue of whether they're still persecuted. Many parts of Yorkshire have control of predators, sometimes for wading birds, sometimes for shooting estates, for different reasons, and they can get caught up in that. But I'm hopeful of both of those being way more widespread while I'm still around, at least.
Yes, I'm certainly hoping that's the case. Um, Sarah, there was a question asking us whether we have any Taros in Britain yet, or whether it's just old breed cattle. And I'm just sort of going to link in a couple of other questions around that. Around a lot of those old breeds that are being used in conservation sites lack horns. And the question really is whether we are missing some of the ecological functions because of that, and also because of the way we manage herds without, say, multiple bulls in the herd that are competing. I know we have the Chilling and wild cattle in Northumberland, but we're sort of lacking a lot of horned animals, and we're lacking in sort of multiple bulls and the behaviours that come from that. So the real question is, have we got any Taros, and is there a functional difference between those and the native breeds?
Yeah, so we don't have any Taros yet. There is a project that's looking at feasibility of Taros in Scotland. So Trees for Life are currently undertaking it for their Dundragon estate. Taros are no more related to aurochs than hardy cattle are. So that's a bit of a myth. They're not any more related. They have just been bred to look like aurochs. So the horns, the size, and they're also generally being brought in to mimic those natural herds. So to have more natural behaviors. With rewilding projects, a lot of them are using hardy cattle. There are some that aren't using horned cattle. Some of them are using horns. If you don't have horns on the cattle, you miss things like some of the um, debarking on trees, as well as some of the other behaviors. But I'd say, regardless of horns or not, the most important thing we need to think about is how we allow, as you say, those cattle to behave as naturally as possible. So to have them in social structures, to have bulls in the field, to have them allowing them to create these kind of social families is really important, but also really challenging. Within our countryside. So we're doing quite a lot of work to try and see how might we have some of these more natural behaviours on rewilding projects. And of course, it comes back to then having space to allow that to happen and to allow them to move in that way. Not a cattle example, but just quickly, Wicken Fen do have natural behaviours for horses at their site. So they've got stallions, and you might have seen it on Wild Isles with the stallions fighting. That's a really great example to show how we can have these social family units within areas where there's also public access. It's horses and not cattle, but I think we can learn from that and start to apply it elsewhere.
Brilliant, thank you. Jeff, another quick one for you. Except I've gone and lost it now. Yeah. Do you think it's actually likely that at any point in the future bison and elk will roam freely, or do you think they're likely to always be in enclosed project sites?
I think for the foreseeable, they're more likely to be enclosed. Particularly in Yorkshire, bison, I understand, are affected by a virus shed by lambs. So they wouldn't work in areas where sheep are, which is quite a lot of Yorkshire. Um, and elk, I think it's maybe a couple of years back we had a talk by Derek Gow for YRN. And he was making the point that you get too large an animal and they don't interact well with roads, not for the sake of the animal alone, but they tend to go through cars and cause fatalities. So would be nice to but I think it's maybe not first of the things that are coming.
Oh, thank you. Very aware of the time, so let's do one more question. Um, Sarah, this one's for you. You mentioned continuous cover forestry, and the person asking the question was thinking of Franz Vera and his ideas of a more open landscape in prehistory. Would it be better to encourage less continuous cover? And how does the huge numbers of closely planted trees fit with rewilding? Are we too obsessed with numbers and forgetting about the space needed for individual trees?
So just a small question to finish
Yeah,
off.
I would say there's probably four questions in
Um,
there.
I so it doesn't go against Franz Vera, so you can also apply the same principles in wood pasture. So when we're looking at that particular forestry, it's about timber extraction. So it's as an alternative to clear felling, which is where they naturally will fell a whole area for crop. It's a more natural approach because instead you're taking out individual trees, you'll still have open glades within that. So it's not closed canopy in that kind of sense that you're thinking of. It's more, it's not clear fell. So it's selective felling to still extract timber, but it's a much more natural process. I completely agree. Dense planting, not natural, not great for stuff because you don't get the light coming through. So generally what we're seeing is a transition away from that on rewilding projects in particular, and having more of this kind of wood pasture open areas, some selective felling approach rather than the dense planting. And of course, we haven't even mentioned that natural regeneration of woodland is much better than planting in some circumstances anyway. So I think that might cover all the points, but let me know if I've missed any.
No, I think that probably does, and I'm very aware we've actually run out of time now. We've overrun a little bit, so there are many more questions, and I'm sure more being formulated. I can see them zipping up on the chat as we speak. So I think I'll draw it to a close there, and just thank you both very much indeed. I did actually see one thing shoot up the chat around the point we were making earlier about pesticides and the use of flea treatment in dogs. I have a dog. I don't know if this answers the question properly or whether it's a particularly good approach, but I treat my dog with an oral medicine once every 3 months, and I understand that's an awful lot better for environmental impact. It's probably not perfect, but it is better than the topical treatments. So,
Thanks, John. Yes, if anyone has suggestions for that, please pop them in the chat now. I'll leave it open for a while. If you've got a cat or dog and think you've got a more nature-friendly way of treating them, as John has suggested, pop it in the chat and we'll pass that on.
thank you. Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you.